and aversions by constant interchange, since, in the event of a milkman or maid going away from the dairy, he was, otherwise, placed in a difficulty. The maid's private aims, however, were the reverse of the dairyman's role. The daily selection by each damsel of the 8 or 10 cows to which she had grown accustomed, rendering the operation on their willing udders surprisingly easy and effortless. Tess, like her compeers, soon discovered which of the cows had a predilection for her style of manipulation, and her fingers, having become delicate from the long domiciliary imprisonments to which she had subjected herself at intervals during the last 2 or 3 years, she would have been glad to meet the Milcher's views in this respect. Out of the whole 105, there were 8 in particular: Dumpling, Fancy, Lofty, Mist, Old Pretty, Young Pretty, Tidy, and Loud, who, though the teats of 1 or 2 were as hard as carrots, gave down to her with a readiness that made her work on them a mere touch of the fingers. Knowing, however, the dairyman's wish, she endeavoured conscientiously to take the animals just as they came, excepting the very hard yielders, which she could not yet manage. But she soon found a curious correspondence between the ostensibly chance position of the cows and her wishes in this matter, till at length she felt that their order could not be the result of accident. The dairyman's people had lent a hand in getting the cows together of late, and at the 5th or 6th time she turned her eyes, as she rested against the cow, full of sly inquiry upon him. "Mr. Clare, you have arranged the cows," she said, blushing, and, in making the accusation, symptoms of a smile lifted her upper lip gently. In the middle, in spite of her, so as to show the tips of her teeth, the lower lip remaining severely still. "Well, it makes no difference," said he. "You'll always be here to milk them." "Do you think so? I hope I shall, but I don't know." She was angry with herself afterwards, thinking that he, unaware of her grave reasons for liking this seclusion, might have mistaken her meaning. She had spoken so earnestly to him, as if his presence were somehow a factor in her wish. Her misgiving was such that, at dusk, when the milking was over, she walked in the garden alone to continue her regrets that she had disclosed to him her discovery of his considerateness. It was a typical summer evening in June, the atmosphere being in such delicate equilibrium and so transmusive that inanimate objects seemed endowed with 2 or 3 senses, if not 5. There was no distinction between the near and the far, and an auditor felt close to everything within the horizon. The soundlessness impressed her as a positive entity rather than as a mere negation of noise. It was broken by the notes of a harp. Tess had heard these notes in the attic above her head, dim, flattened, constrained by their confinement. They had never appealed to her as now, when they wandered in the still air with a stark quality like that of nudity. To speak absolutely, both instrument and execution were poor, but the relative is all, and, as she listened, Tess, like a fascinated bird, could not leave the spot. Far from leaving, she drew up towards the performer, keeping behind the hedge that he might not guess her presence. The outskirt of the garden in which Tess found herself had been left uncultivated for some years, and was now damp and rank with juicy grass, which sent up mists of pollen at a touch, and with tall blooming weeds emitting offensive smells, weeds whose red and yellow and purple hues formed a polychrome as dazzling as that of cultivated flowers. She was stealthily as space. The exaltation, which she had described as being producible at will by gazing at a star, came now without any determination of hers. She undulated upon the thin notes as upon pillows, and their harmonies passed like breezes through her, bringing tears into her eyes. The floating pollen seemed to be his notes, made visible, and the dampness of the garden, the weeping of the garden's sensibility. Though near nightfall, the rank-smelling wheat flowers glowed as if they would not close for intentness, and the waves of colour mixed with the waves of sound. The light, which still shone, was derived entirely from a large hole in the western bank of cloud. It was like a piece of day left behind by accident, dusk having closed in elsewhere. He concluded his plaintive melody, a very simple performance, demanding no great skill, and she waited, thinking another might begin. But, tired of playing, he had desultorily come round the fence, and was rambling up behind her. Tess, her cheeks on fire, moved away furtively, as if hardly moving at all. Angel, however, saw her light summer gown, and he spoke, his low tones quite reaching her, though he was some distance off. "What makes you draw off in that way, Tess?" said he. "Are you afraid?" "Oh no, sir, not of outdoor things, especially just now, when the apple booth is falling, and everything so green." "But you have your indoor fears, eh?" "Well, yes, sir." "What of?" "I couldn't quite say." "The milk turning sour?" "No." "Life in general?" "Yes, sir." "Ah, so am I, very often. This hobble of being alive is rather serious. Don't you think so?" "It is. Now you put it that way, sir. All the same, I shouldn't have expected a young girl like you to see it so just yet. How is it you do?" She maintained a hesitating silence. "Come, Tess, tell me in confidence." She thought that he meant what were the aspects of things to her, and she replied shyly, "The trees have inquisitive eyes, haven't they? That is, seem as if they had. And the river says, 'Why do ye trouble me with your looks?' And you seem to see numbers of tomorrows, just all in a line, the first of 'em the biggest and clearest, the others getting smaller and smaller as they stand farther away. she knew that was only because, like Peter the Great, in a shipwright's yard, he was studying what he wanted to know. He did not milk cows because he was obliged to milk cows, but because he was learning how to be a rich and prosperous dairyman, landowner, agriculturist, and breeder of cattle. He would become an American or Australian Abraham, commanding like a monarch his flocks and his herds, his spotted and his ring-straked, his manservants and his maids. At times, nevertheless, it did seem unaccountable to her that a decidedly bookish, musical, thinking young man should have chosen deliberately to be a farmer and not a clergyman, like his father and brothers. Thus, neither having the clue to either's secret, they were respectively puzzled at what each revealed, and awaited new knowledge of each other's character and moods, without attempting to pry into each other's history. Every day, every hour, brought to him one more little stroke of her nature, and to her one more of his. Tess was trying to lead a repressed life, but she little recked the strength of her own vitality. At first, Tess seemed to regard Angel Clare as an intelligence rather than as a man. As such, she compared him with herself, and at every discovery of the abundance of his illuminations, of the distance between her own modest mental standpoint and the unmeasurable Andean altitude of his, she became quite dejected, disheartened from all further effort on her own part whatever. He observed her dejection one day, when he had casually mentioned something to her about pastoral life in ancient Greece. She was gathering the buds, called lords and ladies, from the bank while he spoke. "Why do you look so woebegone all of a sudden?" he asked. "Oh, 'tis only about my own self," she said, with a frail laugh of sadness, fitfully beginning to peel a lady meanwhile. "Just a sense of what might have been with me. My life looks as if it had been wasted for want of chances. When I see what you know, what you have read and seen and thought, I feel what a nothing I am, like the poor Queen of Sheba who lived in the Bible. There is no more spirit in me. Bless my soul, don't go troubling about that. Why," he said, with some enthusiasm, "I should be only too glad to hear, my dear Tess, to help you to anything in the way of history, or any line of reading you would like to take up." "It is a lady again," interrupted she, holding out the bud she had peeled. "What?" "I meant that there are always more ladies than lords when you come to peel them." "Never mind about the lords and ladies. Would you like to take up any course of study, history, for example?" "Well, sometimes I feel I don't want to know anything more about it than I know already." "Why not?" "Because what's the use of learning that I am one of a long row only, finding out that there is set down in some old book somebody just like me, and to know that I shall only act her part, making me sad, that's all. The best is not to remember that your nature and your past doings have been just like thousands and thousands, and that your coming life and doings will be like thousands and thousands." "What, really then? You had latterly endeavoured to forget. So unpleasant had been its issues, the identity of her family, and with that of the knightly d'Urbervilles, barren attribute as it was, disastrous as its discovery had been in many ways to her. Perhaps Mr. Clare, as a gentleman and a student of history, would respect her sufficiently to forget her childish conduct with the lords and ladies, if he knew that those pure-red marble and alabaster people in Kingsburgh Church really represented her own lineal forefathers, that she was no spurious d'Urberville, compound of money and ambition, like those of Tantridge, but true d'Urberville to the bone. But before venturing to make the revelation, dubious Tess indirectly sounded the dairyman as to its possible effect upon Mr. Clare, by asking the former if Mr. Clare had any great respect for old county families when they had lost all their money and land. Mr. Clare, said the dairyman emphatically, is one of the most rebellious rosums you ever knowed. Not a bit like the rest of his family, and if there's one thing that he do hate more than another, 'tis the notion of what's called an old family. He says that it stands to reason that old families have done their spurt of work in past days, and can't have anything left in 'em now. There's the Billets, and the Trencards, and the Greys, and the St. Quintins, and the Hardys, and the Golds, who used to own lands for miles down this valley. You could buy 'em all up for an old song a'most. Why, our little Reddy Brittle here, you know, is one of the Paridales, the old family that used to own lots of the lands out by King's Hintock, now owned by the Earl of Wessex, afore even he or his was heard of. Well, Mr. Clare found this out, and he spoke quite scornfully to the poor girl for days. Ah, he says to her, you'll never make a good dairymaid. All your skill was used up ages ago in Palestine, and you must lie fallow for 1,000 years to get strength for more deeds. A boy came here the other day, asking for a job, and said his name was Matt. And when we asked him his surname, he said he'd never heard that I had any surname. And when we asked why, he said he supposed his folks hadn't been established long enough. Ah, you're the very boy I want, says Mr. Clare, jumping up and shaking hands with him. I've great hopes of you, and gave him half a crown. No, he can't stomach old families. After hearing this caricature of Clare's opinions, poor Tess was glad that she had not said a word in a weak moment, even though her family was so unusually old as almost to have gone round the circle and become a new one. Besides, another dairy girl was as good as she, it seemed, in that respect. She held her tongue about the d'Urbervilles' fault and the Knights of the Conqueror, whose name she bore. The sight afforded into Clare's character suggested to her that it was largely owing to her supposed untraditional newness that she had won interest in his eyes. Chapter 20. The season developed and matured. Another year's installment of flowers, leaves, nightingales, thrushes, finches, and such ephemeral creatures took up their positions where only a year ago others had stood in their place, when these were nothing more than germs and inorganic particles. Rays from the sunrise threw forth the buds and stretched them into long stalks, lifted up sap in noiseless streams, opened petals, and sucked out scents in invisible jets and breathings. Dairyman Craig's household of maids and men lived on comfortably, placidly, even merrily. Their position was perhaps the happiest of all positions in the social scale, being above the line at which neediness ends, and below the the stress of threadbare modishness makes too little of enough. Thus passed the leafy time, when arborescence seems to be the one thing aimed at out of doors. Tess and Claire unconsciously studied each other, ever balanced on the edge of a passion, yet apparently keeping out of it. All the while they were converging under an irresistible law, as surely as two streams in one vale. Tess had never in her recent life been so happy as she was now. Possibly never would be so happy again. She was, for one thing, physically and mentally suited among these new surroundings. The sapling, which had rooted down to a poisonous stratum on the spot of its sowing, had been transplanted to a deeper soil. Moreover, she, and Claire also, stood, as yet, on the debatable land between predilection and love, where no profundities have been reached. No reflections have set in, awkwardly inquiring, whither does this new current tend to carry me? What does it mean for my future? How does it stand towards my past? Tess was the merest stray phenomenon to Angel Claire as yet, a rosy, warming aberration, which had only just acquired the attribute of persistence in his consciousness. So he allowed his mind to be occupied with her, deeming his preoccupation to be no more than a philosopher's regard of an exceedingly novel, fresh, and interesting specimen of womankind. They met continually. They could not help it. They met daily in that strange and solemn interval, the twilight of the morning in the violet or pink dawn, for it was necessary to rise early, so very early here. Milking was done betimes, and before the milking came the skimming, which began at a little past 3. It usually fell to the lot of someone or other of them to wake the rest, the first being aroused by an alarm clock, and as Tess was the latest arrival, and they soon discovered that she could be depended upon not to sleep through the alarm as the others did, the task was thrust most frequently upon her. No sooner had the hour of 3 struck and wised than she left her room and ran to the dairyman's door, then up the ladder to Angel's, calling him in a loud whisper, then woke her fellow milkmaids. By the time the Tess was dressed, Claire was downstairs and out in the humid air. The remaining maids and the dairyman usually gave themselves another turn on the pillow and did not appear till a quarter of an hour later. The grey half-tones of daybreak are not the grey half-tones of the day's close, though the degree of their shade may be the same. In the twilight of the morning, light seems active, darkness passive. In the twilight of late evening, it is the darkness which is active and crescent, and the light which is the drowsy reverse. Being so often, possibly not always by chance, the first 2 persons to get up at the dairy house, they seemed to themselves the first persons up of all the world. In these early days of her residence here, Tess did not skim, going out of doors at once after rising, where he was generally awaiting her. The spectral, half-compounded aqueous light which pervaded the open mead impressed them with a feeling of isolation, as if they were Adam and Eve. At this dim, inceptive stage of the day, Tess seemed to Claire to exhibit a dignified largeness, both of disposition and physique, an almost regnant power, possibly because he knew that at her preternatural time hardly any woman so well endowed in person as she was likely to be walking in the open air within the boundaries of his horizon. Very few in all England, usually asleep at midsummer dawns. She was close at hand, and the rest were nowhere. The mixed, singular, luminous gloom in which they walked along together to the spot where the cows lay often made him think of the resurrection hour. He little thought that the Magdalene might be at his side. Whilst all the landscape was in neutral shade, his companion's face, which was the focus of his eyes, rising above the mist stratum, seemed to have a sort of phosphorescence upon it. She looked ghostly, as if she were merely a soul at large. In reality, her face, without appearing to do so, had caught the cold gleam of day from the northeast. His own face, though he did not think of it, wore the same aspect to her. It was then, as had been said, that she impressed him most deeply. She was no longer the milkmaid, but a visionary essence of woman, a whole sex condensed into one typical form. He called her Artemis, Demeter, and other fanciful names, half teasingly, which she did not like, because she did not understand them. "Call me Tess," she would say, askance, and he did. Then it would grow lighter, and her features would become simply feminine. They had changed from those of a divinity who could confer bliss to those of being who craved it. At these non-human hours, they could get quite close to the waterfowl. Herons came with a great, bold noise, as of opening doors and shutters out of the boughs of a plantation, which they frequented at the side of the mead, or, if already on the spot, hardily maintained their standing in the water as the pair walked by, watching them by moving their heads around in a slow, horizontal, passionless wheel, like the turn of puppets by clockwork. They could then see the faint summer fogs in layers, woolly, level, and apparently no thicker than counterpanes, spread about the meadows in detached remnants of small extent. On the grey moisture of the grass were marks where the cows had lain through the night. Dark green islands of dry herbage, the size of their carcasses, in the general sea of dew. From each island proceeded a serpentine trail, by which the cow had rambled away to feed after getting up. At the end of which trail they found her, the snoring breath from her nostrils when she recognized them, making an intenser little fog of her own amid the prevailing one. Then they drove the animals back to the barton, or sat down to milk them on the spot, as the case might require. Or perhaps the summer fog was more general, and the meadows lay like a wide sea, out of which the scattered trees rose like dangerous rocks. Birds would soar through it into the upper radiance, and hang on the wing, sunning themselves, or alight on the wet rails, subdividing the mead, which now shone like glass rods. Minute diamonds of moisture from the mist hung, too, upon Aunt Tess's eyelashes, and drops upon her hair, like seed pearls. When the day grew quite strong and commonplace, these dried off her. Moreover, Tess then lost her strange and ethereal beauty. Her teeth, lips, and eyes scintillated in the sunlight beams, and she was again the dazzling dairy maid only, who had to hold her own against the other women of the world. About this time, they would hear Dairyman Greg's voice, lecturing the non-resident milkers for arriving late, and speaking sharply to old Deborah Viander for not washing her hands. "For heaven's sake, pop thy hands under the pump, Deb. Upon my soul, if the London folk only knowed of thee and thy slovenly ways, they'd swaller their milk and butter more mincing than they do already, and that's saying a good deal." Mrs. Crick, this being the invariable preliminary to each meal, the same horrible scrape accompanying its return journey when the table had been cleared. End of Volume 1, Chapter 21. There was a great stir in the milk house just after breakfast. The churn revolved as usual, but the butter would not come. Whenever this happened, the dairy was paralysed. Squish, squash, echoed the milk in the great cylinder, but never arose the sound they waited for. Dairyman Crick and his wife, the milkmaids Tess, Marian, Retty, Riddle, Is, Hewitt, and the married ones from the cottages. Also Mr. Clare, Jonathan, Gale, old Deborah, and the rest stood gazing hopelessly at the churn, and the boy who kept the horse going outside put on moon-like eyes to show his sense of the situation. Even the melancholy horse himself seemed to look in at the window in inquiring despair as at each walk around. "'Tis years since I went to conjure Trindle's son in Egdon. Years," said the dairyman bitterly, "and he was nothing to what his father had been. I've said 50 times, if I had said once, that I don't believe in him, and I don't believe in him. But I shall have to go to him if he's alive. Oh yes, I shall have to go to him if this sort of thing continues." Even Mr. Clare began to feel tragical at the dairyman's desperation. "Gunjerfall, to other side of Casterbridge, that they used to call Wido, was a very good man when I was a boy," said Jonathan Gale, "but he's rotten as touchwood by now. My grandfather used to go to conjure Maitrin out at Owlscombe, and a clever man a were, so I've heard grandfather say," continued Mr. Crick, "but there's no such genuine folk about nowadays." Mrs. Crick's mind kept nearer to the matter in hand. "Perhaps somebody in the house is in love," she said tentatively. "I've heard tell in my younger days that will cause it. Why, Crick, that maid we had years ago, do you mind? And how the butter didn't come then?" Yes, but that isn't the right sort. It had nothing to do with the love-making. I remember all about it. 'Twas the damage to the churn." He turned to Clare. "Jack Dollop, a horse-bird of a fellow we had here as milker at one time, sir, courted a young woman over at Mellstock, and deceived her as he had deceived many afore. But he had another sort of woman to reckon with this time, and it was not the girl herself. One holy Thursday, of all days, in the almanac, he was here, as we might be now, only there was no churning in hand. When we saw the girl's mother coming up to the door, with a great brass-mounted umbrella in her hand that would have felled an ox, and saying, 'Do Jack Dollop work here? Because I want him. I have a big bone to pick with he, I can assure him.' And some way behind her mother walked Jack's young woman, crying bitterly into her handkerchief. 'Oh Lord, here's a time,' said Jack, looking out a window at him. 'She'll murder me. Where shall I? Don't tell her where I be.' And with that he scrambled into the churn through the trapdoor, and shut himself inside, just as the young woman's mother busted into the milk house. 'The villain! Where is he?' says she. 'I'll claw his face for him. Let me only catch him.' Well, she hunted about everywhere, ballyragging Jack by side and by seam, Jack lying almost stifled inside the churn, and the poor maid, or young woman rather, standing at the door, crying her eyes out. I shall never forget it. Never. 'Twould have melted a marble stone. But she couldn't churn, you old witch, screams he. You call me old witch, do ye, you deceiver, says she, when ye ought to have been calling me mother-in-law these last 5 months. And on went the churn, and Jack's bones rattled round again. Well, none of us ventured to interfere, and at last I promised to make it right we are. Yes, I'll be as good as my word, he said. And so it ended that day. While the listeners were smiling and commenting, there was a quick movement behind their backs, and they looked round. Tess, pale-faced, had gone to the door. How warm it is today, she said, almost inaudibly. It was warm, and none of them connected her withdrawal with the reminiscence of the dairyman. He went forward and opened the door for her, saying with tender raillery, "Why, matey?" He frequently, with unconscious irony, gave her this pet name. "The prettiest milker I've got in my dairy. You mustn't get so vagged as this at the first breath of summer weather, or we shall be finely put to for want of by dog days. Shan't we, Mr. Clare?" I was faint, and "I think I am better out of doors," she said mechanically, and disappeared outside. Fortunately for her, the milk in the revolving churn at that moment changed its squashing for a decided flick-flack. "'Tis coming," cried Mrs. Crick, and the attention of all was called off from Tess. That fair sufferer soon recovered herself externally, but she remained much depressed all the afternoon. When the evening milking was done, she did not care to be with the rest of them, and went out of doors, wandering along she knew not whither. She was wretched, oh, so wretched, at the perception that, to her companions, the dairyman story had been rather a humorous narration than otherwise. None of them, but herself, seemed to see the sorrow of it. To a certainty, not one knew how cruelly it had touched the tender place in her experience. The evening sun was now ugly to her, like a great inflamed wound in the sky. Only a solitary crack-voiced reed sparrow greeted her from the bushes by the river in a sad, machine-made tone, resembling that of a past friend whose friendship she had outworn. In these long June days, the milkmaids, and indeed most of the household, went to bed at sunset or sooner, the morning work before milking being so early and heavy at a time of full pails. Tess usually accompanied her fellows upstairs. Tonight, however, she was the first to go to their common chamber, and she had dozed when the other girls came in. She saw them undressing in the orange light of the vanished sun, which flushed their forms with its colour. She dozed again, but she was reawakened by their voices, and quietly turned her eyes towards them. Neither of her 3 chamber companions had got into bed. They were standing in a group, in their nightgowns, barefooted at the window, the last red rays of the west still warming their faces and necks and the walls around them. All were watching somebody in the garden with deep, was standing over the way tub to let off the whey, and the shade of his face came upon the wall behind, close to his, who was standing there filling a vat. She put her mouth against the wall and kissed the shade of his mouth. I saw her, though he didn't. "Oh, is Hewitt," said Marianne. A rosy spot came into the middle of Is Hewitt's cheek. "Well, there's no harm in it," she declared, with attempted coolness. "And if I be in love with him, so is Reddy too. And so be you, Marianne, come to that." Marianne's full face could not blush past its chronic pinkness. "Aye," she said. "What a tale! Ah, there he is again. Dear eyes, dear face, dear Mr. Clare. There, you've owned it." "So have you, so have we all," said Marianne, with the dark frankness of complete indifference to opinion. "It is silly to pretend otherwise amongst ourselves, though we need not own it for other folks. I would just marry him tomorrow." "So would I, and more," murmured Is Hewitt. "And I too," whispered the more timid Retty. The listener grew warm. "We can't all marry him," said Is. "We shan't, either of us, which is worse still," said the eldest. "There he is again." They all three blew him a silent kiss. "Why?" asked Retty quickly. "Because he likes Tess Durbeyfield best," said Marianne, lowering her voice. "I have watched him every day and have found it out." There was a reflective silence. "But you don't care anything for him," at length breathed Reddy. "Well, I sometimes think that too." "But how silly all this is," said Is Hewitt impatiently. "Of course he won't marry any one of us, or Tess either. A gentleman's son who's going to be a great landowner and farmer abroad, more likely to ask us to come with him as farmhands at so much a year." One sighed and another sighed, and Marianne's plump figure sighed biggest of all. Somebody in bed hard by sighed too. Tears came into the eyes of Reddy Brittle, the pretty red-haired youngest, the last bud of the Paradiles so important in the county annals. They watched silently a little longer, their three faces still close together as before, and the triple hues of their hair mingling. But the unconscious Mr. Clare had gone indoors, and they saw him no more, and the shades began to deepen. They crept into their beds. In a few minutes they heard him ascend the ladder to his own room. Marianne was soon snoring, but Is did not drop into forgetfulness for a long time. Reddy Brittle cried herself to sleep. The deeper-passioned Tess was very far from sleeping, even then. This conversation was another of the bitter pills she had been obliged to swallow that day. Scarce the least feeling of jealousy arose in her breast. For that matter, she knew herself to have the preference, being more finely formed, better educated, and, though the youngest except Retty, more woman than either. She perceived that only the slightest ordinary care was necessary for holding her own in Angel Clare's heart against these her candid friends. But the grave question was, ought she to do this? There was, to be sure, hardly a ghost of a chance for either of them in a serious sense, but there was, or had been, a chance of one or the other inspiring him with a passing fancy of her, and enjoying the pleasure of his attentions while he stayed the or not. Why should she, who could never conscientiously allow any man to marry her now, and who had religiously determined that she never would be tempted to do so, draw off Mr. Clare's attention from other women, with the brief happiness of sunning herself in his eyes while he remained at Tabitha's. Chapter 22. They came downstairs yawning next morning, but skimming and milking were proceeded with, as usual, and they went indoors to breakfast. Dairyman Crick was discovered stamping about the house. He had received a letter in which a customer had complained that the butter had a twang. "And begad, so to have," said the dairyman, who held in his left hand a wooden slice on which a lump of butter was stuck. "Yes, taste for yourself." Several of them gathered round, and Mr. Clare tasted. Tess tasted. Also the other indoor milkmaids, one or two of the milking men, and last of all Mrs. Crick, who came out from the waiting breakfast table. There certainly was a twang. The dairyman, who had thrown himself into abstraction to better realise the taste, and so divine the particular species of noxious weed to which it appertained, suddenly exclaimed, "'Tis garlic, and I thought there wasn't a blade left in that mead." Then all the old hands remembered that a certain dry mead, into which a few of the cows had been admitted of late, had, in years gone by, spoilt the butter in the same way. The dairyman had not recognised the taste at the time, and thought the butter bewitched. "We must overhaul that mead," he resumed. "This mustn't continue." All having armed themselves with old pointed knives, they went out together. As the inimical plant could only be present in very microscopic dimensions to have escaped ordinary observation, to find it seemed rather a hopeless attempt in the stretch of rich grass before them. However, they formed themselves into line, all assisting, owing to the importance of the search. The dairyman at the upper end with Mr. Clare, who had volunteered to help. Then Tess, Marianne, Hewitt, and Retty. Then Bill Lewell, Jonathan, and the married dairywoman, named Beck Nips, with her woolly black hair and rolling eyes, and flaxen Frances, consumptive from the winter damps of the Watermeads, who lived in their respective cottages. With eyes fixed upon the ground, they crept slowly across a strip of the field, returning a little farther down in such a manner that, when they should have finished, not a single inch of the pasture would have fallen under the eye of some one of them. It was a most tedious business, not more than half a dozen shoots of garlic being discoverable in the whole field. Yet such was the herb's pungency that probably one bite of it by one cow had been sufficient to season the whole dairy's produce for the day. Differing from another in natures and moods so greatly as they did, they yet formed, bending a curiously uniform row. Automatic, noiseless, and an alien observer passing down the neighbouring lane might well have excused for massing them as Hodge. As they crept along, stooping low to discern the plant, a soft, yellow gleam was reflected from the buttercups into their shaded faces, giving them an elfish, moonlit aspect, though the sun was pouring upon their backs in all the strength of the noon. Angel Clare, who communicatively stuck to his rule of taking part with the rest in everything, glanced up now and then. It was not, of course, by accident that he walked next to Tess. "Well, how are you?" he murmured. "Very well, thank you, sir," she replied demurely. As they had been discussing a score of personal matters only half an hour before, slowly, with an excruciated look, till quite upright. And you, matey Tess, you wasn't well a day or two ago. This will make your head ache finely. Don't do any more if you feel fainty. Leave the rest to finish. Dairyman Crick withdrew, and Tess dropped behind Mr. Clare. Mr. Clare also stepped out of line, and began privateering about for the weed. When she found him near her, her very tension at what she had heard the night before made her the first to speak. Don't they look pretty? She said. Who? Is Hewitt and Retty? Tess had moodily decided that either of these maidens would make a good farmer's wife, and that she ought to recommend them, and obscure her own wretched charms. Pretty? Well, yes, they are pretty girls, fresh-looking. I have often thought so. Though, poor dears, prettiness won't last long. Oh no, unfortunately. They will be excellent dairywomen. Yes, though no better than you. They skim better than I. Do they? Claire remained observing them, not without their observing him. She's colouring up, continued Tess, heroically. Who? Retty Brittle. Oh, why is that? Because you are looking at her. Self-sacrificing as her mood might be, Tess could not well go further and cry. Marry one of them, if you really do want a dairywoman and not a lady, and don't think of marrying me. She followed Dairyman Crick, and had the mournful satisfaction of seeing that Claire remained behind. From this day, she forced herself to take pains to avoid him, never allowing herself, as formerly, to remain long in his company, even if their juxtaposition were purely accidental. She gave the other three every chance. Tess was woman enough to realize, from their avowals to herself, that Angel Clare had the honour of all the dairymaids in his keeping, and her perception of his care to avoid compromising the happiness of either in the least degree bred a tender respect in Tess for what she deemed in the self-controlling sense of duty shown by him, a quality which she had never